Awesome. Well, I'm just going to get us started right on time here. Yeah, thank you all so much for joining us. I'm excited to have Jim Webster here from Wildfire Partners. Um, and he's going to present about home hardening and defensible space. And my name is Kiara Forster. I'm the Forest Program Director with the Watershed Center. We're a small nonprofit. It's our 20th birthday this year. So we're excited to celebrate with all of you through events like this. The goal of tonight is really to hopefully provide some actionable information and resources and connection with this amazing organization that is Boulder County Wildfire Partners, which you'll learn about over the next hour. And We are both members of the Vrain Forest Health Partnership, which is a collaborative of basically every agency and entity you can think of, all the alphabet soup working together to improve forest resilience to wildfire, water resource supply resilience to wildfire, as well as community readiness for wildfire. So we'll kick it off there. If you have any questions, you can hold them until the end, or you can put them in the chat and I'll read them off at the end. But we'll have a Q&A after Jim presents here. So thank you all. All right, Jim, over to you.
Thanks so much, Kiara. Really pleased to be here, and thanks everybody for joining us. We'll see on the technology, and we'll go forward. Just mention that we are Boulder County's Wildfire Mitigation Program, Wildfire Partners, and we sit in the Community Planning and Permitting Department. I'm going to focus this discussion on insurance with the discussion of homeowner insurance with the home hardening and defensible space and how they interact, some of the challenges, some of the opportunities. There's a lot to discuss. So we also have a website, wildfirepartners.org, listed here, so you can get additional information on our website. I'm going to talk a little bit about how homes ignite. These are pictures of a laboratory in South Carolina where the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety tests building materials and other mitigation practices. And these are ember generating machines. And you can see on one side, there's a home that's unmitigated, and that home ignites with those embers. And on the other side of the home, we have a home that's mitigated and does not ignite. So we're going to talk a little bit about the science of how homes ignite and those principles. But embers are really what destroy most homes during a wildfire. People think of the big flames of the forest fire engulfing the forest and then taking down the homes. Here's a picture of a home that ignited from embers. You can see that the forest and the trees are intact. Oftentimes, homes can be ignited more quickly than the vegetation surrounding them. So here's an example of embers traveling sometimes up to a mile or more. That's spotting ahead of a fire, landing on a home or vulnerable part next to the home and igniting those homes. So we talk a lot about embers and home hardening, and we look at the vulnerabilities of the home so those embers cannot ignite a home. The other principle that we'll talk about here is, mitigation. We've all heard about this, right? We heard about this when we were children, that we want to think in advance, have some forethought, understanding our surroundings, and prepare for catastrophic events. So the idea of we want to build homes that are made of brick and not straw, and do that upfront work to really mitigate. And the good news with wildfire mitigation is even if you haven't built that home of brick, there's ways to harden structures to reduce that ignition potential. So we really look at that ignition potential and try to prevent those homes from igniting based on those home hardening and defensible space principles. Our national goal is to live with wildfire. So we don't eliminate it. We learn how to live and prevent homes from igniting during wildfires. And just a quick overview concept of defensible space. It's not the perfect term because we want homes to stand alone. There won't always be a firefighter to defend the home, but the idea is to reduce those pathways for flames. This is a little different than the embers with vulnerabilities, but reduce those flames from igniting the home. So we look at 3 zones, 0 to 5 feet, 5 to 30, and 30 to 100 to reduce that direct flame content, that radiant heat. Here's an example of hardscape right up next to a home in that first 5 feet. So we do the most intense defensible space up next to homes and then gradually reduce those fuels as we move farther out. But the idea is we start with the home and move out to look at all the vulnerabilities and those pathways and have mitigation measures to prevent homes from igniting. Oops. Just a second here. And so we're going to talk about and show some examples here that the science of mitigation with our home hardening and defensible space can prevent ignitions. Here's an example of that fire coming up to the home. It had lots of embers on top of the home and next to the home. Because it was mitigated, those embers did not ignite, and then preventing that flame and that radiant heat from contacting the home, coming up, and then running out of fuel, and the home survived. So we're going to get into that, but we're going to talk first a little bit about the homeowner mitigation insurance. A little of the focus here. We do a lot of defensible space, home hardening talks, but insurance is really a big issue. A lot of people have questions about insurance and the interaction of that homeowner mitigation and insurance, given the challenges with affordability and insurability these days. So we're going to start off and talk about the glass half empty, some of the challenges with insurance, and look at why there are so many challenges and the difficulties that we're facing. And then we're going to switch to sort of the glass half full, some of the positive messages that we have when it comes to homeowner mitigation and insurance. So starting off with sort of the glass half empty and understanding the reasons why we have these challenges of why that glass is half empty. And the first one I think people are well aware of in Boulder County is that we have a high wildfire risk. In Colorado here, we know about California as the state with most homes at risk, but Colorado, we're number 2. So we have a high wildfire risk in this community, and that's important. We all recognize that. And not just in Colorado, but Boulder County has a very high wildfire risk. We've lost more homes than any other county in the state. So we live in a community with very high wildfire risk. And so that's the first thing that we point out when it comes to insurance. We are at risk. And the other things we're all very familiar with is extremely high costs associated with wildfire events and the losses during wildfire. We're talking billions of dollars, and we're familiar with recent LA fires. And so one of the important factors when we look at insurance is we have a very high risk and there are very high costs associated with these wildfires. Again, not new to anybody on this call. And a big factor in looking at insurance is our risk is increasing. And so we're going to talk about having larger fires, more destructive fires year-round. We're familiar with the Marshall Fire happening in December. We've had fires in every single month in Boulder County. Here's the Cameron Peak Fire and its footprint overlaid on Boulder County. And so that's a large fire encompassing a large percentage of Boulder County. So this risk, not only is it very high in Boulder County and very expensive, this risk is increasing. And that's driven by several factors, but we really have entered into a new era of climate-driven wildfires. So we can't just insurance can't just look at the past and the losses in the past to predict the future. We're going to see larger, more wildfires, and that's just not next year, looking 10, 20, 30, 50 years into the future, significant changes in our climate and direct impacts on wildfire risk. And so the future is one of growing wildfire risk based on increased temperatures. So it's a big factor that we have to consider when looking at insurance. And it's not just about wildfires. That's one factor that impacts our insurance affordability and availability. Complicated graph here, but one thing I want to point out is that hail is the major driver of insurance rates recently. This bar on the right, 2023 was a really bad hail year. It wasn't a wildfire year in terms of losses in wildfire, but hail drove the recent increases in 2024. So there's a lot of other things happening in addition to wildfires, even around the world with reinsurance rates and increasing catastrophic events worldwide. That's affecting insurance. So there's a lot of things that are affecting insurance availability and affordability, wildfire being one, but there's a lot of other factors too. So we've seen obviously rates increases cancellations, non-renewals, and part of it is driven by wildfire. But want to point out, we're going to talk about wildfire this whole talk, but just wanted to let you know that there's a lot of other things going on too. So another factor that we want to look at is this change is recent in terms of the increase in wildfire. I pulled up a presentation I gave 10 years ago, and we were talking then in 1993 to 2012, the statistic here with US catastrophic losses, 1.7%. So when I first started this job over 15 years ago, it's like wildfire was not a high priority for insurance companies. They didn't pay it a great deal of attention. And so we've seen a big change recently. And change, when we have change, that adaptation takes time, right? And so we've seen that major increase globally. I just pulled up a stat where, before 2015, it was about 1% of, this is global losses, and now it's at 7% in the last 10 years. So that's a dramatic increase in the last 10 years. And what's going to happen in the next 10 or the next 20? I mean, it's really, things are changing rapidly, and it takes time to adjust to this change and to catch up. So we're paying catch up, and the insurance companies are playing catch up because of this relatively recent change. Another thing in terms of wildfire mitigation and insurance, these are pictures for the 4 Mile Canyon fire. So we had the 4 Mile Canyon fire in 2010. And so we're not even asking the right questions in terms of which homes are mitigated or the ignition potential of homes. When we had the 2010 fire, even we have some more recent fires, we're not even asking the question, was a home mitigated? And it's really difficult in today's situation even to ask the question if it's mitigated. We can ask somebody if they're wearing a seatbelt because that's a standard practice, but asking somebody after a home was lost, was the home mitigated, is not something we're just starting to ask that question. And then how do we answer that question? Yes, it was mitigated. Well, to what standard? Did someone verify that inspection, or was it maintained? So in terms of just starting to ask the question, what homes were mitigated? Was that mitigation maintained? And who verified it? And was that mitigation successful? So there are a lot of challenges when it comes to quantifying that mitigation and that risk. And this is not a completely new issue. We've tried politically to address the problem of insurance availability and affordability at the state level. Governor Hickenlooper back in 2013 created a task force to look at the issue. Unfortunately, that task force in the report did not produce many results or solutions. So it's a challenge because this is a really tough issue. So there's been some challenges at the state level. There have been some attempts, but to date, not a lot of effective action. An additional challenge here, painting this picture of the challenges we're facing, is that insurance companies and not only not asking the right question, lack of good data. We have loss history. Insurance companies have the loss history of all the fires in the past, and they can look at homes have been lost and their location. And we've had FireWise USA since 2002, right? So we have communities identified that at least have started some mitigation. But there's really no evidence or not significant evidence from that underwriting actuary perspective of participation in FireWise in terms of saving homes. And it's not surprising. People that know FireWise, it's a great program, but it's at the community level. You could have homes of straw or unmitigated homes within that community, just as well as you have some homes of brick or some mitigated homes. So, and that's one reason there's some challenges of documenting the impact of mitigation when it comes to things. We're not necessarily tracking all these mitigation efforts effectively and not being able to see that in the data. So we have risk models and risk scores, but these have been really frustrating in the past. So California has the most experience with this, giving homes a score and basing that quantification risk based then on the availability of insurance or the affordability of insurance. But those scores are limited. And just in the past, some of these scores, most of this work is in California and participated in hearings and testimony on this. Some of the challenges is in these past models, the models show the fire stopping at city boundaries, with cities having little or no risk, and we know that's not the case. Some of the models assumed all the homes in the burn perimeter were destroyed. And again, with mitigation, we know that we can save homes, but the models would assume everything in that burn perimeter is gone. These scores not necessarily recognizing homeowner mitigation, and not based on the science of that home ignition. And we'll talk a little bit more about the science, but what's really important is the details, those little things where the embers can ignite homes. And so, recognizing those small details are really important in having a home survive, but those are not necessarily incorporated in the models. Another frustration with the models is that homeowners might receive a score and they have no idea how they got that score. Not a lot of transparency or what that means or understanding that production. And the other frustration is some of the models don't allow people to really change their score. So somebody could do a great job of mitigation and their score doesn't change. And that's really frustrating if the model is just based on factors that a homeowner can't influence. So there's been challenges with those models as well. And I just pulled up this screen. I know there's a lot of words here and you don't have to read them all, but this is one example from Munich Re, one of the world's largest reinsurers. And this is their new model that they're marketing and selling on their website, Wildfire HD. And we talk about one step forward, one step back. So they have updated their models, and now that fire doesn't stop at the city boundary. So places like Paradise now have increased risk as they've moved their buffers and their boundaries out 1.5 miles from a wildland fire area. But now their models are not looking at this model only looks at hazard. It doesn't look at vulnerability. So they've mapped the state and eventually the whole country with a map and a model and a score from 1 to 100, but they're just looking at that hazard. So they're looking at the wind and all the factors of fuels in terms of the likelihood of a fire, but they're not incorporating in that mitigation. So that's sort of one step back where this model, it's great because you can produce a score. I mean, they're selling this to insurance companies. They can produce a score for any home in the state based on that map characteristic, but it doesn't take into consideration that mitigation that really does impact the home survival. And my last glass half empty, I know we're ready to switch gears because this is all a little depressing, but talking about other Wildfire Partners has a certification program we're going to talk about here in a little bit, but going home by home is challenging because there's a lot of homes out there. So IBHS has created a Wildfire Prepared Home Designation Program. Back in June 2022, they launched that in California, but they only have 1,000 or so homes as of March of this year designated in the entire state of California. And so when we had the LA fires, there were no wildfire prepared homes were located in those areas of widespread structure-to-structure conflagration. They did have 3 homes in the area that might have had some degree of exposure, but in terms of impact, that's really a drop in the bucket in terms of mitigation and tracking that mitigation when it comes to the large scale that we're dealing with. All right, now we got to transition. We talked about some of the challenges and why insurance is challenges with affordability and availability in the future that we're going to be facing in this new era of climate-driven wildfires. But now I want to switch in terms of some solutions and why the glass is half full, and really focusing a lot on Boulder County on why we have some opportunities. This is a picture of the Cold Springs fire here. And one of the reasons the glass is half full is we have the science, we're understanding, we have tools where we can reduce the ignition potential of a home with that home hardening and defensible space. So there are solutions out there. It's not easy. There's a lot of challenges as we just gone through, but we have some opportunity to make progress. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that now. And one of our focuses here in Boulder County with the creation of Wildfire Partners. In the beginning, we started this back in 1989 with our first regulation. We spent a lot of time in the 90s trying to quantify risk. Just what we talked about, risk scores. We scored over 2,500 parcels. We'd go out and look at all the factors and the inputs and come up with a ranking. You can see the colors on the map of red being extreme and orange being high and moderate being yellow. So we did a lot of work on that quantification. But really the key here in terms of saving homes is just not working at a desk or coming up with a model. It's actually getting out there and doing mitigation. So we wanted to really focus on homeowner action and reducing that ignition potential of the homes. And so in, just sort of building upon that idea with the science, we wanted to work with the nation's best science and use their science. So this is not Boulder County science. This is an article from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, where the leading mitigation professionals across the country came together and wrote this article. And these are the folks we work with to design our mitigation program. And it really is a new approach in terms of looking at reducing risk, and it really focuses on community and homeowner responsibility. And so we're not going to assume that all those homes in that burn perimeter or fire will be destroyed. Through mitigation, we can help homes survive. And of course, if a firefighter is there, that's an added bonus, but we can't assume firefighters will be at every home. So we want homes to be able to stand alone and not ignite. And if there's firefighters that can help with that survival of that home, even better. In this article, if you have a chance, if you're really interested in wildfire policy, encourage you to read that. It really talks about the Wildfire Partners as a new model for preparing for the future of climate-driven wildfires. And so talk a little bit about Wildfire Partners. Some of you may be familiar, some of you may even be partners. But the idea here with the insurance companies, we created a public-private partnership. And it's the first parcel level certification program. And we don't want to, again, just quantify the risk and give it a score of 1 to 100. We want to recognize and reward and record effective mitigation. And this is homeowner, parcel by parcel, home by home, going through and reducing that ignition potential with the home hardening and defensible space. And I think, we're talking insurance here, so that recording is important, because if we just go out and have videos or websites or people read a brochure, we don't know what they've done, right? And so the idea is to provide technical assistance and financial assistance, and then record that mitigation and recognize it with a certificate. And this is a yard sign that we provide people who have completed their mitigation. It has a sticker, like a license plate sticker with the year. And so we're going to talk a little bit about Wildfire Partners and the idea of recognizing and rewarding and recording mitigation. And so we can document some of the impacts, that positive impacts that mitigation has. And so our assessment, on-site assessment, we go to the individual home with the homeowner, have 50 questions, and we'll look at all the vulnerabilities and pathways. And this is a little bit of a snapshot on that top there. For every of the 50 questions, you'll get a green for a good job, a yellow, something that you could do, but a red are things that we really require you to do to obtain a certificate. And so each person, after their assessment, receives a customized assessment report and checklist with photos and annotation and description of what to do. And then they work towards completing those mitigation requirements to obtain a certificate and get recognized. And what we've done is worked with insurance companies to get them to accept the certificate as proof of mitigation. And we've had hundreds of homeowners since we created the program in 2014 that have been able to obtain or retain insurance because of the mitigation certificate. And started the program in Western Boulder County in 2014. You see that as Fire Zone 1 in the west, and really started with 8,997 homes. And that includes those in unincorporated county and the 4 municipalities of Lyons, Ward, Jamestown, and Nederland. And really working towards getting 6,000 homes mitigated. And if we can pass 6,000, even the better. But the idea is to work at scale and get individual homes mitigated, and then everybody in the community mitigated, because neighbors impact neighbors. Just a couple of numbers. There's a lot of numbers in the screen. Won't go over all of them. But so we've done 5,437 initial assessments. So towards that 6,000 goal, we're getting close. And this doesn't necessarily include all the homes that have been mitigated. We have additional homes that have been mitigated through the building code before. But anyway, this is Wildfire Partner statistics, and we've got over 2,000 certificates. So that's more than the entire state of California in terms of what we've been doing here in Boulder County. And it's hard work. Some of these numbers here, the numbers on the screen are through 2024, the first 11 years, but it takes an average of 1.2 years, 14 months or so to complete for a certificate. And people spend an average of 103 hours working on this. So it's a lot of work, average 11 mitigation measures. So we've been working on this for 14 years and a lot of activity across the county. But those numbers are good, but it's really the quality of the mitigation that's important. And then we have to have, with the insurance companies, we have to have success stories. So the testing we don't get tested often. And that's one of the issues with accountability of mitigation, is that we don't get a fire that frequently in terms of the big picture that destroys homes. And so when we have that opportunity, we want to see what is the impact of that mitigation, all this work, and then have that be recognized by insurance companies in terms of lower premiums as the eventual goal. Our first goal with partners was just to be able to obtain insurance, and so get people to recognize that insurance. But we'll talk a little bit about the end of the long-term vision of discounts. But I'm going to go through some of the fires that we've had here in the county where we've had Wildfire Partners homes, and just show you some photos of some homes that survived, just to show you some of those visuals of, yes, homes within a berm perimeter. Not all are destroyed, that through mitigation that we can prevent homes from igniting. And we're going to start with the Cold Springs fire up around Ned in 2016. And we'll just run through some photos of homes where the fire came right up to the home, surrounded the home, and the home survived. And mitigation, and in some cases suppression, played a big role in preventing those home ignitions. So we had a number of homes, and we'll go through the stats after, just run through some photos. And then, we have these photos in terms of showing the impact, but then we also want to look before and after to tell that story and look what was done and do a case study. So we've also gone on site with these homes, but the first thing to do is just to show that there are homes that have been well mitigated that survive a wildfire. And this is a home, not necessarily a Wildfire Partners home, but this was built according to our building code. We look at the ignition resistant construction requirements in the defensible space, and we issue a certificate of occupancy when a new home is completed. And so that's just like a Wildfire Partner certificate in the sense that it's been inspected by a wildfire mitigation specialist on our team. So we have examples from the first fire of Cold Springs fire of homes not igniting. This is the same home that you see here. And we had one Wildfire Partner certified home at that time in 2016, 2 years into the program. And we had 18 other homes that have performed mitigation with Wildfire Partners or through that county building code. And all 19 survived, and 8 of their neighbors did not. And so in some cases, we have really good stories of mitigation impacting home survivability. Next story, in terms of the next fire, in terms we have the 2020 Calwood fire. Here's a home that was mitigated in Hile Valley Ranch. That mitigation, again, the story of that home survival. If those flames with the defensible space don't contact the home, or the radiant heat is less, and the embers don't ignite the home with the good home hardening, then the home survived, even though the fire comes right through that community or right through that home. A couple more aerial pictures of the Calwood fire and good mitigation, where the home survived because of mitigation. And again, doing site visits after the fire to look at the specifics and looking at the before, understanding what the mitigation was done before. So having these examples from the Calwood fire and telling those stories. Same home again. This is an in-holding within Hile Valley Ranch. And then we went and visited a lot of these homes, and here's a Wildfire Partners yard sign, and looking at the details of what was performed and why this home did not ignite. And it's the details. Good ignition resistant construction, but they have that first 5 feet without the combustible materials, and a lot of other details that we look at, and we'll see where there were embers that landed all on top of and around this home, but did not ignite the home because of the materials and the good mitigation work. And in some places, people will talk about, okay, what is the roof covering, and that is the information or the only information an insurance company might have. But we really care about the details, and so the certification process and the education process talks about all these details. And here's an example of a home in the Calwood fire. They have a good tile roof, non-combustible roof, but they also did what we call bird stopping. And so if you don't close off those openings or those gaps, then those embers are going to enter and ignite the home, even if you have good roof covering. And so those details are things that we look at in terms of importance of mitigation. And again, details here in this home where we look at the type of furniture that are on the deck, and that base of walls is a really important point, because you could have stucco siding. We've seen a lot of stucco siding homes ignite because they'll have a gap at the bottom of those details where we want to make sure that there aren't places for embers to enter in behind a wall and ignite even a non-combustible wall. So looking at all those details afterwards helps tell the story for those homes that were able to survive because of mitigation. Here's an example of a home. We talked to the homeowner, and they had the time before evacuating, and they removed pine needles and other fine debris, pine cones, and that helped save their home. And so lots of good stories about mitigation impacting home survival based on the education and the mitigation performed. We didn't have as good results as in the Cold Springs fire. We did lose 2 certified homes. We had a home that survived and 4 other mitigated homes through the building code and Parks and Open Spaces efforts with us that helped survive. So we did have examples of mitigation working in the Calwood fire, but it's not a guarantee. Trying to understand more about, we have lost 2 homes that have been certified to wildfire, but the percentages still of mitigation greatly outweigh those that are unmitigated. We've got the Stone Canyon fire, just run through a lot, some more aerials quickly here of homes that survived that did really good mitigation with county wildfire mitigation program assistance. And sometimes it is a combination with firefighting resources. You'll see there was some aerial resources for some of these homes with retardant. But examples, if we know how to build homes that will not ignite, these are new. Some of these are newer homes with good ignition resistant construction, defensible space. So those embers landing on that roof or did not get into the vents, and that those flames did not contact the structure to ignite the structure. Again, you can see some of the orange there. That's some of the fire retardant, but you could understand that this property has good defensible space, so there's not going to be direct flame contact on that home, or the radiant heat's less, that will not ignite that home. And then for the ember, that home hardening, a good roof and good windows, and no place for those embers to ignite that home. Another example here of a home that survived. And we're going to go into a little more detail just because aerial photos aren't enough. We want to see actually the mitigation that was done. And we've got some idea here that this home, they contacted us in December of 2023 to get an assessment. And then they worked really hard. They had an insurance deadline and insurance motivation here. So for the next 2 months, they performed a really long list of mitigation measures, over 100 sumacs removed, and we'll go show some examples of what they did. And they received their certificate in February, and then the fire happened in July. And so good stories of this mitigation clearly in documenting how that impacted the home survival. So we'll just go through very quickly some of the things that they did. And looking beforehand, their propane tank was a lot of grass around that propane tank. So they mitigated that propane tank and removed that brush as one example of one common mitigation measure. Again, we have 50 questions and we look at all these mitigation vulnerabilities. So beforehand, they had lattice under their deck and other items under their deck. We have a rebate for decluttering under decks because that's a really big thing that we do in mitigation, is get material out from underneath those decks that the embers will ignite. Again, removing that lattice and those flammable materials up against homes and garages is a key piece. And so again, we have a lot of pictures before and after this home where if this mitigation had not taken place, all those embers would have ignited this home. And so, the homeowners convinced and been sort of a poster couple for mitigation and been featured in a number of media interviews and stories and articles. Again, we low limb trees to make sure they're not ladder fuels, and we can get a crown fire where crowns fire can move from crown to crown. Again, really good mitigation efforts. And so having these before and after photos, firewood piles, moving that firewood pile is key to another mitigation measures. But having these before and after photos and documenting what homeowners do is essential to what part of this recording of mitigation for future understanding of wildfire risk. In the Stone Canyon fire, some of the stats here, there were 35 homes in the burn perimeter. 7 had received a Wildfire Partner certificate. All 7 of those had survived. And 6 additional homes that we'd worked with through the building code that in the last 25 years had been built according to ignition resistant materials. All 6 of those survived as well. And those 5 homes in that fire, in the fire, there was a total of 5 homes lost. And I know some of those pictures, people say, well, there's no vegetation, a lot of removing everything. But one of the messages from our mitigation is we're not clear cutting that defensible space. You'll see this green around the home where they retained, even though they removed a lot of material, they retained a lot as well. So we can have mitigation that's aesthetically pleasing as well as reducing wildfire risk. Coming towards the end here, but I want to talk about a new Colorado wildfire insurance law that involves risk scoring and mitigation and discounts. Some of you might have heard about. It was called House Bill 1182, and it's got some hope. The idea that lack of transparency that I mentioned earlier with those wildfire risk scores was really frustrating to people. So we passed a law in the state, and now insurers, as of July 1, 2026, are going to be required to, in general, we'll talk about the generalities. There's some specifics that are important too, but they're going to provide now an annual written notice to policyholders to explain how they're quantifying that risk and classifying the risk. So instead of a black box, consumers are going to have a better understanding of their insurance company's quantification of their risk and their risk score. And that's really important. There's language in there also in terms of companies that use risk models having to factor in mitigation. We talked about the frustration of homeowners not being able to change their scores, even though they've done really great mitigation and can prevent their homes from igniting, as we've seen in those many examples. But now the laws requires companies to factor in that mitigation if they do certain modeling practices. And then discounts. We haven't had discounts as a common practice in mitigation, but that's what we want to work towards. And so there's language in the law about offering discounts. There's still a lot of challenges. There's right now the insurance companies and the Division of Insurance at the state level are in negotiations on how the law will be implemented, and a lot of unanswered questions. And so hopefully this will implement it in a positive light where it can have a tremendous impact on motivating and incentivizing people to perform mitigation. But we're a long ways to go because I mentioned a lot of the challenges, and really we still need to do a better job of having more and more people do mitigation and showing the benefits of the mitigation. So still a long way to go and to figure out how the law will be implemented in terms of what discounts will be offered, what information will be shared, and how that will be factored in. But we're set up. The good news, the glass is half full. We're set up in Boulder County in some ways better than anyone else because we've had the Wildfire Partners program. And our goal, of course, is to get people that have achieved a Wildfire Partner certificate to get that recognized in this new law and maybe someday leading to a discount. Now, there's no guarantees that was going to happen, but that's our effort to try to have some benefit to get, again, the reward, the recognition of the mitigation. So that new law is coming soon. In July, it will be implemented, but still a lot of questions on, each company might decide to do different things in terms of their discounts and what they offer and then what they require for a discount. And so a little bit of summary here. And so there are a lot of factors that determine whether a home survives a wildfire. A lot of factors in terms of, we have different types of wildfire in terms of the fire behavior and the wind and the heat. And some fires will be more intense and others in terms of both the size and the amount of heat generated and the amount of home destruction. So there are a lot of factors in terms of whether a home survived. And we've talked about the home hardening defensible space. Suppression is a big important factor as well. And we have individual mitigation success stories. And sometimes this is more anecdotal information on the benefits of mitigation. We also have research, right? Those laboratory studies that we're studying this. So we have some success stories, but we're still a long ways away in terms of for potential insurance discounts and other uses. We need more and better data that really can show the differences in the outcomes between mitigated versus unmitigated homes. And we're really lacking that right now. And we're not even necessarily collecting it. So we've got a long way to go to really show the benefits of mitigation before we get significant insurance discounts. So in the end, we really need more people joining the Wildfire Partners program. So we really encourage you to participate in partners and to get everybody in your community to participate, because we have to, again, document, record, and show the benefits of mitigation. And we need more Wildfire Partners certified homes. And that the idea here is a lot of people start with mitigation, but we want people to complete and do all the mitigation measures to get all those vulnerabilities and pathways addressed. And then we're growing the program, so it's just not Boulder County. We're not big enough to change the entire insurance market for the country. We need more and more counties to start these programs. Again, we started 12 years ago. We've been encouraging other counties to use the same approach, and now in California and Oregon and Wildfire Prepared. So we're moving there, but it's going to be baby steps. It's going to take a long time until we really get mitigation as a common practice, like seatbelts and airbags, where it's recognized and understood by insurance companies. And so with that, Kiara is going to open it up for questions, and look forward to talking more. That's my information there. And again, our website is wildfirepartners.org. So thanks
so much, Jim. That's awesome. Really appreciate all of that information you just shared. And we've got some great questions in the chat. We're just gonna go in order here. So the first question was, you had mentioned a couple of homes, certified homes that were destroyed during wildfire. And there's a question about whether you did a kind of post-mortem analysis of those, and and if you found the main driver of what caused the homes to ignite.
Yeah, those two homes that we visited, so we did visit them in the past. That Mountain View, the subdivision there, Mountain Ridge, I'm confusing because Mountain View Fire is on my mind because I work so closely with Mountain View Fire every day. But that the Calwood hillside that had the 18 homes, it was a dense forested community, and we couldn't really figure out all the reasons of those two homes igniting in terms of what was maintained. I mean, there's little things like even when you evacuate, if you leave a window open, or even if somebody's coming to check on you to get you to evacuate and they left the door cracked open. And so we don't have that video evidence or all the details of watching that home from a remote sensing or drones ignite. And so, it's possible that, there was some lack of maintenance, or in terms of, the density of trees that were removed in the defensible space. The radiant heat was so much that it did ignite the home, and there should have been some more tree removal. So we tried to make that assessment, and we couldn't nail down one specific vulnerability or pathway that ignited those two homes. But some were, the certification was a couple of years previous, so that might have had an impact with maintenance. But good question, but we don't have the exact answer. But those are the things we need. The point is we have to start answering those questions and collecting the information. And we're doing this. We're trying to go out post fire and do the assessment. You really have to get out there quickly, or even talking to firefighters, or getting some more evidence now with AI and other things that we can actually, people now have cameras that might provide some evidence of what, where do they ignite. One of the really good things about the Calwood fire is we know a lot of homes ignite after the flaming front. The two that were lost, in this case, were with the initial flaming front, but we had firefighters sleep at some of the homes that survived. And then during the middle of the night, the wall ignited and got into the interior of the wall assembly. And just because they were sleeping there, they were able to put out that fire and save the home. If they hadn't been sleeping there, that home too would have been lost. So it's tough to know exactly.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you, Jim. Yeah, it's all of these assessments are done right at that one point in time. And so to think about the longevity of them and those little factors that happen during an event. One thing I'll add is there was a study done by the Wildfire Research Center after the East Troublesome fire, where they had done kind of parcel level rapid wildfire risk assessments beforehand. And then they looked at which homes, it was kind of outside of the certification process. So it was out of any certification process. So it was just looking at risk factors prior to this fire coming through. And they saw that one of the biggest kind of contributors to the likelihood of a home igniting was um, combustible attachments. So things like fences or decks that were made of combustible materials. So really looking at all of those as vulnerabilities, and Wildfire Partners has really great information on and recommendations for how to look at that within a specific home. Um, there's another question about whether I'm actually going to tie this one in next. There's a question about what is the um, brown material that is used right next to the home. So I think talking about the 0 to 5 feet, what's kind of the recommendation for things placed there? Is that right, Jessica? Yeah, cool.
There's several options, and the ease of maintenance. I mean, if you have the flagstone or poured concrete, it's easier to clean off those pine needles. But in terms of ignition resistant or non-combustible material, bare soil, or our main recommendation and the most common is a weed barrier and gravel, and that's smaller size. Um, if you do put in the big river rock, you get pine needles that get caught between the rocks, and they're kind of hard to remove. So thinking about maintenance in terms of getting out material that might accumulate in terms of pine needles and leaves. That flagstone looks really nice, and that's a good material if you like that aesthetic.
That's great. Yeah, I love the thinking about trying to remove things from your to-do list later down the line. That's a good a good tip and good way to think about it. Um, there's a question about whether there's a Wildfire Partners program available in other counties like Larimer. Um, and I'll put in the chat the link to the Larimer County Wildfire Partner Program. And Jim, I'm sure you can talk about the differences and what's available right now potentially.
So we've worked with our neighboring counties and counties around the state to encourage them. We've helped a number of counties start programs, and actually staff from Wildfire Partners is spread out across the state in California and Texas to share the message. And we've worked with Larimer County to help create a position there, and work the insurance companies. They're a smaller program. Our program is growing. And one thing I failed to mention in my presentation in terms of the funding from all our work, it's thanks to all of you. We passed a Boulder County wildfire mitigation tax following the Marshall Fire. And so for the last, and that was 2022, and the election was 72% support. So we have funding. The Larimer County program is not funded at the current level. So they just have one position where we have a large staff. And so they're much smaller, and they're just getting started. But Jefferson County, is creating a very large program with some real resources and some funding to hire staff and do similar things to what we do. So it's happening. Other counties are starting to build programs.
Thanks, Jim. And I'll toot Boulder County's horn there. It is nationally renowned as a program. So it's cool to see that these kind of lessons learned and frameworks can be utilized in neighboring spots. Kind of tying off of what you said perfectly, but thinking more at the homeowner level, are there any grants or subsidies to help offset the cost of mitigation?
Yeah, so we have a couple, and they're growing, but our current, and we've had this for the 12 years, is we have a list of forestry contractors and our contract with the county. And so if somebody who's had an assessment chooses one of those contractors, we'll do a cost share agreement where we'll pay half of that, 50-50, up to $2,000. So we cap our share at $2,000 just so we can spread the money to as many people as we can. So we do have financial assistance for the forestry work. And if you're need-based, that share can increase. So people of low income, fixed income can get a larger percentage or even 100% of those forestry costs. We also have a rebate program that's eligible to any single person in the county, so you don't have to participate in an assessment. You can be in the city of Boulder anywhere, and we have a $500 rebate for doing 6 different calls to the action. That includes junk your juniper and mitigating your fences and screening your vents and base of walls and decluttering under deck. and one more that first 5 feet. So we have that $500 rebate, and we've had that for 2 years now. Applications are closed this year, but it'll come again next year. And if you do one rebate 1 year, you can get another rebate the next year, as long as it's not the same call to action. And then we also have free chipping programs, and we're developing a free dumpster program where communities can come together and do the maintenance of their defensible space. So if you get 5 homeowners together or more, we'll come and chip your slash from that mitigation for free. And we're developing a dumpster program where communities can get, again, that we call it accumulated life debris, that stuff underneath the deck or all those other non-vegetative combustible materials that we want out of there. So we're developing dumpster event programs as well. So those are our main financial incentives right now.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, no, Jessica just actually put in here that so she's been helping coordinate her neighbors for that chipping program for a few years now, and
Great.
has glowing reviews of it. So
Yeah, and the county also has community forestry sort yards, so we support those as well. And I think people might be familiar with those community forestry sort yards, but those are a free service for our county and actually neighboring county residents as well, where you can drop off material, including your weeds and pine needles, for free.
yeah, that's great. Also add kind of on the larger parcel size as well. We do so the Watershed Center, and then if several of our partner organizations like Colorado State Forest Service, the Boulder Valley and Longmont Conservation Districts, and I think those are the main ones that work on private land. We will also help by obtaining grants to conduct work. So there's a couple folks on here who are part of those, but typically we look across a community. So we'll try to do community-wide forest management projects, and that's more focused kind of outside of 60 feet from structures, more looking at kind of the forest ecology to decrease likelihood of that high severity fire and protect water supplies and the community as a whole. But we've been able to secure grants for that, including from the Boulder County Wildfire Mitigation Tax Strategic Fuels Mitigation Grant Program, as well as state funding, federal funding. And so one of the things that we really emphasize is kind of getting lots of neighbors together, and then coming to us with, hey, we've got this community that really wants to do work, and then we can work with you to develop plans and apply for grants for that. So just wanted
that's really important. I didn't mention, thanks for doing that, because really homeowners can't come directly to us for that. So go to the Watershed Center and work with Kiara on those larger forestry projects. And then we do have that Strategic Fuels Mitigation Grant Program that will complement state and federal funding. So that's sorry I didn't mention that, but that's really for going to the Watershed Center or a conservation district or fire district with a larger project. So great addition, because that really complements. I mean, in terms of, a lot of people ask, in terms of, we focus what I've talked about today, the homeowner responsibility on the hardening the home in a defensible space, but we really complement that with the entire landscape. And that's the work the Watershed Center and so many others do. And so we need both. It's not one or the other. So you can't just do mitigation of the home and ignore the entire landscape, or you can't just work on the landscape and ignore the home. We really complement. And that's why we're here together with the Watershed Center and partners working together, because it really is, these are complementary efforts. It's not an either or.
couldn't have said it better. Hand in hand, skipping down the lane toward wildfire resilience. We've got a couple other questions. One is about, we know that there's a lot of senior citizens in this area, and wondering about, could there be more volunteers, like volunteer programs to kind of help. And one thing I'll note is that we are actually from the St. Vrain Forest Health Partnership side. So we recently did a household survey of all the residential parcel owners in the western side of the St. Vrain watershed. And we got 31% of those back. So thank you if you responded. But we did hear that from folks, was that a big barrier is the physical ability to do that work. So the St. Vrain Forest Health Partnership will be developing a volunteer day next year in Allens Park in partnership with the Allens Park Fire Protection District. And it's going to be difficult logistically, and we're excited to learn some lessons and make it happen. But yeah, so that'll come up. And Jim, I don't know if you have anything to add on the
Yeah,
volunteer.
we have so many programs I haven't mentioned, Paul. We work on ditches, we work on some of the things, but we do have a youth program. And so for many years, we've been partnering with the Mile High Youth Corps and Teens Inc. I was meeting with Teens Inc. today. And so we provide those free services to seniors and vulnerable individuals and communities. We did 43 homes back up in Allens Park a few years ago with the Mile High Youth Corps. And so great idea. We launched this idea many years ago because we have youth with strong backs and a lot of motivation. Some are becoming hotshots after they work with us and work in the crews, but we have a program specifically to bring youth and vulnerable individuals, elderly, limited income, underrepresented populations. We're working in mobile home parks throughout the county. And so, and we're growing those programs. And so great idea. And, these programs, we can't service everybody. So like Kiara said, we really encourage community work days where neighbors helping neighbors. And we have a model in the county called Saws and Slaws, where community members get together and like an Amish barn raising, they mitigate a neighbor's home in the morning and they share a meal. So many things that we're trying to do to get mitigation. And we've only touched the surface on it today.
Awesome. And then last little question, if you could repeat the kind of stone to use and not to use immediately adjacent to homes.
Yeah, and today we have three containers that we put on our table to show people the stones, and the 3/4 inch gravel is a good size. And so some people will go to the finer pea gravel, and sometimes if you keep that compacted, that works too. If it becomes too light if you want to use a leaf blower, if you really use that pea gravel, it can work in certain situations, but sometimes it's a little too fine and you might get a little spillage or when you're trying to maintain. So we like that a little larger than the pea gravel, that 3/4 inch gravel.
Awesome. Thanks, Jim. Well, I'm going to put the link again in the chat to the Wildfire Partners page. If you have any questions about, how to navigate that, feel free to reach out to me and I can connect you with the right people, or to Maria, who sent all the emails before. We can help connect you with anyone. And we did record this, so if you want to share it with friends, feel free. We also have a recorded webinar about kind of navigating home insurance policies with United Policyholders, a nonprofit that works with folks around insurance specifically. So if you want to watch that, that's also on our website. But thank you so much for taking the time. We really appreciate you joining us tonight, and feel free to reach out anytime with questions. Thanks so much, Jim, for taking your time on a whatever day it is, Tuesday evening, to share all of your expertise with us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for organizing this.
Thanks. All right.